Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am creating a card using the Blooming Botanical stamp set by Newton's Nook. And I'm starting off by using my stamp positioner here and stamping the large image. It's almost a background. You can almost fill a whole card panel with this. I'm stamping this onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. Not worried about really centering it. I'm going to be cutting this down later. I put this in my stamp positioner just in case I had to stamp it twice. This is a huge image. Actually, I got a pretty good impression the first time, but I did end up stamping it twice just to keep that bold black outline. And then we'll move on to the Copic coloring. I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here. I'm just going to show you the different color combinations and the way I colored each of the flowers. Starting off with these large lilies, I'm using my R81 as my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, which will be right in the center where the petals meet in the middle and where some of those petals are kind of lying underneath another. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, and I'm just adding a little bit of this, few flicks in the center of the petals and just creating those shadows for those petals laying underneath. Next, I'll move on to my darkest midtone, which is my R85. Extend that out a little bit. Move on to the R83. Extend that R85 out a little bit more, just leaving a highlight right there on the tips of the petals for my R81. I wasn't getting enough contrast here. I wanted a little bit more dimension, I guess, and I didn't want to add my dark color in too much. I wanted to reserve that just for the center. So I ended up going back in with my R85 and just extending those flicks out a little bit further than I did the first time, and then skipping my lightest mid-tone color and going right back in with my R81 and just blending those flick lines out from the R85 a little bit more. I colored the other two lilies the same exact way. I'm not going to show you those. I'm pretty much just going to show you one of each of the flowers. Next, we'll move on to our RV markers, and I'm starting off again with my lightest color. Here I'm only using 3 colors. This is a smaller flower, mapping out my darkest areas right there in the center. Just doing 3 little tiny flicks with my darkest color, moving on to the mid-tone color, extending those flicks out a little bit further, and then finally going back in with my lightest color to blend all of that out. Again, colored all of these the same exact way. For the center of those little flowers, I'm just going in with a solid color here. There's really no shading that is needed here. For my next flower here, I'm going to be using a combination of R markers as well as a Y marker. I'm just laying out a little bit of my lightest color there in the center, then going on to my darkest R marker, which this is actually red. This is truly red, an R27, and just adding a tiny little bit there, extending that out with my R22 a little bit further, then going in with my R02 and extending that almost out to the end. Then I'll move back in with my R01 and fill in the rest of those petals. Next, I'll go in with my Y00, or is this 00? 000, and just adding a little bit of yellow to the tips of those petals. For the inside of the flowers, I'm using 3 colors here, concentrating my darkest areas being on the outside of that little circle to make it look like the inside is raised up a little bit. I colored all of these the same exact way as usual, and we'll move on to this next flower, and we're going to move on to our purples, our violets. So I'm going right in with my darkest color here, and I'm just adding a tiny little bit where each of the petals meet in the center or where one lies over another, and just doing a very soft line with just the tip of my marker, barely touching the paper here. For the center of the flower, I just put a dot of my darkest color right there in the center. Next, I'll move on with my mid-tone, and I'm just extending that out a little bit further, Now it's hard to kind of keep track of which ones you've already colored and which ones you haven't. So I may have skipped a few petals, but in the end, it just actually gives it more dimension. Next, I'll go in with my lightest color and go over that pretty quickly. I don't want to overblend here. I want to be able to keep that contrast. Again, color the other two flowers the same exact way with the same color combination. Next, we'll move on to this flower here, and I'm going to be using Y markers as well as YR markers, starting off with my lightest color, mapping my darkest areas out, just adding a teeny tiny bit of my darkest color right there in the center, blending that out with my darkest mid-tone and creating those shadows for the petals that lay underneath another. Extend that out with my lightest mid-tone, and then finally going back in with that Y marker and blending all of that out, coloring the petals on these flowers all of the same way. And for the center of the flowers, I'm going to color these similar to that other flower that we did there with the two-tone petals, concentrating my darkest area being on the outside of the little circle, extending that out with a mid-tone, and then just a little bit of a highlight right there in the center to make that look raised up a little bit. For my next flower, I'm going to color this similar to the one I colored purple with the V markers. It's shaped a little bit differently and it's a little bit bigger, so it's kind of easier to work with. But starting off with my darkest color again, just laying out my darkest areas where the petals are laying underneath the other petals. And some of these petals are really teeny tiny, especially on the outside of the flower. So you just want to make sure that you're barely touching the paper here. Keep in mind that even though your markers may not bleed, this color will spread a teeny tiny bit. So you do want to make sure that you're just using the tip of your marker. Next, I'll go in with my darkest mid-tone here and just extend those areas out. For the larger petals, they're not large by any means, but they're larger than those outside petals. I am using a little bit of a flicking motion just to get a better blend. Next, I'll move on to my lightest mid-tone. Again, basically doing the same thing, just leaving a small highlight there, especially on the larger petals in the center of the flower. The ones on the outside, I'm really not able to leave too much of a highlight, if any at all. Now this is when I forgot and realized that my two markers that I have for the light RVs, it's a RV02 and a RV11, they're both completely dried up. So I used my hex chart to see which color is the closest to one of those, and I found that the R81 is pretty similar to the R11, RV11 rather. So I'm just quickly going over that, trying not to pick up any of that dark color. Keep in mind that light Copic colors are going to pick up and drag darker colors. So when you're doing your blending and going over with your highlight color, you want to be kind of quick. You don't want to overblend and move that color around too much. Next, for these flowers, I'm going to switch over to some blues, starting with my darkest color, putting my darkest area in the center as well as the tips of these petals, blending that out with my B02 and keeping the highlight for my B00 right there in the center of the petals. This will make it look like the petals are kind of bowed out or bent out a little bit. For my leaves, I am using some YG markers, and I'm going to have to adjust my camera here. I am very sorry. That is my boy Frankie. So I'm going to have to kind of move over because he was not going to get down. I am laying out my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, which will be where the leaf is underneath that flower, and putting down my darkest color, blending that out with my mid-tone, and then my lightest color again. For these little fill-in flowers here, I'm just using two colors, my BG11 and my BG13, and I'm just literally doing one flick with that BG13 on each of the petals. Once all of my coloring was done, I did want to go back and add some details with a white gel pen. For the stamen of the lily, we completely covered over those. So I'm going to just draw in my little stamen. You can pretty much see the image right through the coloring. So I'm just kind of going over there, the part of the image that's already there. I'm not making this up. They're really there. And then I'll add some color to the middle of some of the smaller flowers, the ones that we colored with the BG markers. I didn't color the center of those. I kept those white. And also I added just a few little dots on that larger flower that we used the RV markers on. I wasn't overly happy with the blending there. So by just adding a few dots, that will kind of distract the eye from the horrible blending job that I did. Once my panel was completely done, I did trim this down and kind of just go around the edges. And my plan is to cut this into strips. And this is kind of scary because you've spent all this time coloring, but I didn't want to just lay it flat onto my card base. And I did switch over to my smaller paper trimmer here just because I felt like I had a little bit more control. And I did measure my panel, and I thought I planned out how large each of my strips had to be in order for them to fit across the card panel equally. But I measured wrong, or I divided wrong anyway. So instead of 4 strips going down my panel, I am only going to be left with 3, which is fine. So I placed these onto a card base just to kind of see if this was all I was going to need, and it was just lacking something. There just was missing something. The card base was just a little bit too big for the little strips. So I ended up taking another piece of the Nina Solar White and cutting this with a scalloped rectangle die and arranged my little strips onto that, and I liked that much better. So here is where my mistakes, this is the second mistake. My measuring was the first. So I'm taking my Scotch foam tape and adhering this down, and I started with the middle strip, which was wrong. Don't start with the middle one. Start with the edges. But I started with the middle one anyway, laid out my other panels on either side, and I did not press down, or I didn't think I pressed down on my Scotch foam tape too hard, so I thought maybe I could move it around. I couldn't. It was completely stuck down and tore my paper when I tried to get that middle one off to straighten that out a little bit. So I ended up ripping all 3 panels off this panel, and I'm going to rearrange them onto another piece of cardstock that's die cut with the same die. In order to easily remove these, I use my heat tool on the back of the panel and kind of melt some of that adhesive. You're still going to get most of the paper coming up with it, but it's a lot easier to peel off if you kind of heat up and melt that adhesive. So I took another piece of the cardstock there, cut down with my die, and I still have the foam tape on the back of these strips, but they're not as sticky as they were before. So I'm keeping that foam tape there, and I'm going to use that for my dimension, but I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to make sure that these are adhered to my card panel. And this time I'm doing the right thing by starting off on either side, lining those up, and then centering my middle panel there, or my middle strip. I put that aside and we'll work on the sentiment. I took a piece of black cardstock, and this is just from my scrap bin, treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped that with my Versamark ink, and sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and went ahead and heat set that. I did cut this down into a pretty thin strip. There's not too much room left on either side. I wanted to make sure that my background was not going to be completely covered up. I didn't pop this up, being my little strips were popped up. I just put some Tombow Mono Multi Glue right there on the strips themselves and laid this flat across them. Next, I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer, and there's Frankie again, being very determined to be a part of the video. And I just added a little bit of shimmer to the lilies, the 3 lilies, and I left all of the other ones plain, I guess. And then I adhered this flat onto an A2 size card base, and I used a light pink card base. And this is the third mistake that I made on this card, and I'm sure every single one of you has done this at least once before. I am gluing this down flat with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and I adhered it upside down. And luckily I noticed it quick enough where the glue hadn't set yet, and I was able to rip that up and flip it right side up. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.